We've talked a lot over the years about the many different promotions and territories that would form the foundation of the company that would give us Crow Sting, Goldberg, and the NWO. But before any of that could happen, this company itself needed to have its own origin story. And that's what we're finally here to discuss, because this is the history of World Championship Wrestling. Thank you so much for the support over on Patreon to Meiji Stray, Freehand, and the Reflection of Perfection. To get your own Patreon shout out, please sign up on my Patreon page. Now, just to be perfectly clear, this episode is primarily going to focus on the very early years of World Championship Wrestling. And I mean the one from Atlanta and not the one from Australia. But how early are we talking here? Well, since I've already covered the history of Jim Crockett Promotions and the history of Georgia Championship Wrestling, as well as covered the events of Black Saturday and a lot of the other parts that went into making WCW in previous videos, I figure let's pick up where those left off. Oh, by the way, stick around to the end if you want links to those videos. Anyway, for now, our story begins when Ted Turner purchased Jim Crockett Promotions on October 11th, 1988, where it was originally incorporated as the Universal Wrestling Corporation by TBS. Of course, that name would not stick. The sale became completed on November 2nd, 1988, the same day as a television taping of the show NWA World Championship Wrestling, which took place in the company's official home office of Atlanta, Georgia. Now, World Championship Wrestling was the name of the old NWA show, and with it being familiar to their audiences, WCW would become the name of the promotion under Turner. Having experienced a backlash of Black Saturday, Ted Turner knew the importance of maintaining the familiar to their established audience during the changeover. It should also be noted that initially it was still a part of the National Wrestling Alliance. Again, already covered, but to quickly recap, one way or another, Crockett had acquired control over several major promotions, and JCP more or less operated as the NWA itself, trying to compete nationally and going against their competition of the WWF. And now that Ted Turner had purchased Jim Crockett Promotions, WCW would also effectively be doing the same thing going forward. Although that's not to say that everything remained the same. One of the most major occurrences happened right away in the new regime. Going into the purchase, Dusty Rhodes was the head booker. Now, he had a run of success early on, but he had begun to burn out, as bookers tend to do after a while. Especially when considering that Dusty was booking against Vince McMahon in the 80s. That's Vince Prime. There's no way that could have been easy to do. Although he did have one major victory, as he booked the show Clash of Champions to air against WrestleMania, but he did it on cable instead of pay-per-view. And with this strategy and in the midst of direct competition, Sting vs. Flair for 15 minutes managed to outdraw that of Mania. And this moment would let everyone know that Sting was a star. But despite this, Dusty's booking career was winding down. He would continually overuse what would be known as the Dusty finish, and he would begin to clash backstage with Ric Flair. And most of all, the straw that would break the camel's back would be when he scripted himself to do a forbidden spot at Starrcade on December 26, 1988. Dusty booked an angle where he would get cut open from a Road Warrior spike. This was in direct violation of Turner's new no blood policy, and with Dusty's dismissal, it showed that the new owner meant business. The American Dream was replaced by Ric Flair, even though the Nature Boy was also the current world champion at the time. Flair had brought in seasoned talent such as Ricky Steamboat and Terry Funk. However, he was also continuing to develop the fresh talents from the old guard too, such as the previously mentioned Sting, who Flair had promised to drop the title to, only for Sting to wind up getting injured. This led to the company instead wanting Ric Flair to put over Lex Luger as the new champion, but Flair refused, wanting to stay true to his word. This, of course, was viewed by some as a conflict of interest, as there were those who felt that Flair was monopolizing the world title and abusing his power as head booker. As a result, Flair was fired from his booking position in 1990, although unlike Dusty, who was fired completely and left for WWF, Flair would still remain on as a wrestler, at least for the time being. And he would also get to win the world title after this, even without the power of the book. His position would be given to fellow Horseman member Ole Anderson, although this meant a somewhat surprising shift, as Ole began making the program more like the competition, the WWF, aiming more at younger audiences by featuring over-the-top style gimmicks and promotion, with such stunts such as bringing in RoboCop to WCW. And yes, somehow an R-rated movie character was considered marketing towards children. What can I say, it was a different time back then. This change in tone was all the more shocking when we remember that Ole was the booker for Georgia Championship Wrestling, who famously was the one who got the shaft when Black Saturday occurred. However, this is not to say that Ole didn't retain some of the old ways. Some might even say he did just a little too much, as Anderson primarily focused on older talents that had remained loyal to him throughout the years. This, combined with other factors, would result in WCW's house shows dropping to record lows. Despite this, World Championship Wrestling would still seek to break out on its own, distancing itself from the NWA. After all, what's the benefit of being in an alliance if you pretty much are the alliance? I mean, you're aligned with yourself anyway, so what difference does it make? And so, even though Ric Flair was recognized as the NWA World Title holder, WCW began referring to him as the WCW World Champion, and other measures like that would continue. What was once NWA Starrcade in 1989 would become WCW Starrcade in 1990, as they started pushing more and more of the NWA branding out, only to then officially split from the alliance in 1991. Although some ties would still remain. Ric Flair would win the championship from Sting at this time, being awarded the NWA's big gold belt, but being referred to as the WCW World Champion. The promotion would somehow simultaneously continue to claim the NWA's lineage while still maintaining that this was now the WCW Championship. Weirder still, the NWA also still recognized Flair as their champion. And all this happened while WCW was still using the NWA's physical title belt. Well, that is, until a man named Jim Herd. Jim Herd was an outsider to the wrestling industry, serving as both a manager of KPLR-TV in St. Louis and also as a manager for Pizza Hut. And with that resume, he somehow became president of WCW, and he would have a direct clash with champion Ric Flair, where he allegedly wanted the Nature Boy to shave his head and start using a brand new gimmick, that of a gladiator named Spartacus, in order to more closely resemble the type of presentation one would find in the WWF. And then, after failed contract negotiations, Flair would be fired and stripped of his world title, at least in spirit, as the physical belt was still in Flair's possession. For you see, back then it was customary for their champion to pay a large cash deposit for the belt, which you would get back upon returning it once your reign was over. According to Flair, they refused to give him his money back, and so Flair figured that the belt was his for the keeping, after essentially paying $25,000 for it, and therefore he saw no problem in taking the belt all the way to the WWF, where it appeared on camera during Flair's debut for Vince McMahon. After this, WCW went back to the NWA to renegotiate a partnership deal, and with their powers combined, they sued the WWF to get them to stop showing the belt on TV. Before we continue, if you're enjoying yourself, please hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed to this channel, and also see that your notifications are working. That way you know whenever brand new content comes out. Anyway, with that being said, let's get back into the video. But alas, Flair wasn't the only one who had problems with Jim Herd. Stan Hansen, Jim Cornette, Stan Lane, and the Road Warriors all left the promotion due to Herd. To make matters worse, starting in 1991, the company began to drop significantly, and so Herd was fired in January of 1992, and was briefly replaced by a man named Kip Allen Frey, only for Cowboy Bill Watts to take over later that year. Now, Watts would become a highly controversial figure in WCW, as they placed a strict code of conduct upon talent and had several issues concerning prejudice, particularly accusations of anti-Semitism from Paul Heyman and Raven. This resulted in Watts resigning, and so he would be replaced by a protege of Vern Gagne, who hailed from the American Wrestling Association, and that man was none other than Eric Bischoff. Well, there you go, the early history of WCW. Do you want a part 2 to this? Let me know down in the comments, and please make sure you give this video a like and that you're subscribed to Dave Knows Wrestling. I want to thank you for watching, and I want to thank all my awesome Patreon supporters. And as always, Dave knows.